Hello and welcome to the Walled Garden podcast. Today I have for you our very final masterclass with Kai Whiting and Leonidas Konstantakos. Now these two have been extremely generous with their time, giving us a 9-part masterclass series on Stoicism. And we're rounding things off today with a conversation about Stoicism and God. So definitely something that we can fit into a 45 to 50 minute episode. But nonetheless, this is an overview. And so you're going to find some very interesting ideas presented to you in this episode. And I will let you know that our conversation with our supporters who came along to the meetup actually lasted maybe an hour after the initial lesson from Kai and Leo. And so, man, we had a great time really kind of dissecting these ideas, really getting to know these concepts in the kind of group Q&A setting. And so if you would like to hear this episode in its totality, with the conversation afterwards as well, including all of the other conversations that we've had in this masterclass series, then you can go to thewalledgarden.com and you can join up there, and all that is available on the Walled Garden. And so you're going to get the whole masterclass, including our masterclass on the unity of virtues, the equality of errors, the dichotomy of control, circles of concern, character, love, cosmopolitanism, and of course this one on God. And do remember that if you're going to join up with the Caretaker membership, you can use the promo code PRACTICALSTOIC, all in caps, and that's going to get you a discount for the first 100 members on the Walled Garden. Now, I do want to mention also that it's no mystery that Kai and Leo are so well versed in this philosophy because they have written a book together about it. I highly recommend that you grab yourself a copy. It's called Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In, and I will put the links to where you can grab that book in the show notes. And please give them a good review if you enjoy the book. And that's just another way to say thank you to these two amazing individuals who have taken so much of their time to share with the world their wisdom and their understanding of Stoicism. So again, Kai, Leo, thank you so much to both of you. And as you all know, this is not the end of our collaborations. There's going to be much more in the future. So please enjoy this masterclass on Stoicism and God. Welcome, everybody, to discuss this idea of Stoicism and God. And I wanted to just give a little brief summary of my own kind of experience with this topic and Stoicism. Obviously, because many of you will know that I've recently begun studying theology and have been kind of led on that path through many, many different, experiences in my own writing, and also just experiencing the absolute deluge of this kind of wrestling with the idea of God, both in the Stoics and just in all of the ancient writings in general. Like that, this was not a topic that they thought was not serious, that it was not a topic that they felt was trivial in any way. It was something that so many people in the ancient world were really trying to figure out earnestly, honestly. And so for me, I started seeing all of this and thinking, there's something to this. I got very interested in it. Even just this idea that obviously in the ancient times, more recent times, but it was said that theology was the queen of the sciences and philosophy her handmaiden, and I started really thinking about that. Like, what does that actually mean? Why is this the case? And there was a moment there on my Facebook group when somebody joined the group, and one of the answers to the question that they had was, well, the question was essentially, why are you here? Why are you interested in Stoicism? And their answer was, I'm looking forward to getting to know this godless philosophy, or something like that. And then I started to think, hang on, no, Epictetus talks about God a lot, and prayer a lot, and divinity, and so does Marcus Aurelius, and so does Seneca. I mean, I want to read you guys something today from Seneca that just blew my mind, because I was really undergoing a kind of a massive personal transformation in the past year and a half, where really trying to grapple with these questions. And I was having a genuine experience of trying to kind of open up some of these mysteries in my own mind and see where it took me. And so when I actually read this from Seneca, this is in his first book of his Natural Questions, or his first letter of Natural Questions. When I read this, it just blew my mind, because I thought, man, Seneca is having a lot of the same sort of thoughts, experiences in the mind that I feel I've been having. And not to say that I am anywhere close to figuring out the sort of things that Seneca may have figured out, but I just read this and I thought, this is such a good picture of perhaps how some of the ancients felt about this question of God. So anyway, he says this: I, for one, am very grateful to nature, not just when I view it in that aspect which is obvious to everybody, but when I have penetrated its mysteries, when I learn what the stuff of the universe is, who its author or custodian is, what God is, whether he keeps entirely to himself or whether he sometimes considers us, whether he creates something each day or has created it only once, whether he is a part of the universe or is the universe, whether it is possible for him to make decisions today and to repeal in part any sort of universal law or fate, whether it is the diminution of his majesty and an admission of his error that he had done things which had to be changed. If I had not been admitted into these studies, it would not have been worthwhile to have been born. And then he kind of goes on to talk about, what really are we here for? Is it just here to just eat and fill our bodies? And, he goes on to make this point. It's like, what is the point of all this, if not to question deeply, to wrestle with these questions, to try and gain some sort of understanding of the cosmos that we're a part of, before we inevitably die. But that line there, if I had not been admitted into these studies, my life would not have been worth living. That's crazy. For somebody to say that and to mean that in their writing is absolutely wild. And I just started thinking, Seneca really took this seriously. And there's a couple of other things that I just quickly want to read you here, because he also says, the mind cannot despise colonnades, paneled ceilings gleaming with ivory, trimmed, shrubbery, that's it, and streams made to approach mansions, until it goes around the entire universe, looking down upon the earth from above, an earth limited and covered mostly by sea, while even the part of the sea is squalid or parched and frozen, says to itself, is this that pinpoint which is divided by sword and fire among so many nations? Anyway, I'm going to stop there with this, because there's so much more. And if you want to really get a sense of how Seneca felt about this question of God, go read that first letter of his Natural Questions. It's really beautiful the way that he writes about it. But so when I read this is kind of the final thing I'll say. I had in mind this idea that Jordan Peterson taught a lot of people, which is, hey, go back to the Bible and take a look at this word Israel. What does Israel actually mean? Where does it come from? Israel means they who wrestle with God. So the Israelites, the Jewish people, they are the people who wrestle with God by definition. That's the thing. So it's not a matter of just blind belief. It's not a matter of just saying, I'm with God. It's wrestle with the question. And we see this with Seneca. Look at all the questions that he asked about God. It's like, does he do this? Does he do that? Is this? He's asking all these questions and he's trying to get to the bottom of something, right? All the while knowing that it's way too complicated. He uses the word mysteries. It's way too complicated for him to grasp in totality, but he's wrestling with the question. That's what I love about Seneca's passage there. And so in a way, that has all led me to being very excited to actually start to wrestle with these questions, not to just immediately assume that our ancestors were idiots or, just had these completely blind beliefs in something that they had no idea about, but to assume that there was as it said, this central animating spirit that they were trying to kind of understand, to allow it to inspire their minds to higher thinking. And so, that's why I wanted to at least tag on to the end of this masterclass series today, this idea of God. And I'm going to throw it over to Leo and Kai, because obviously they're going to teach us about the Stoic conception of God. And before I do that, Kai and Leo, our very last meet up today, and thank you so much for all the effort you guys have put in. This has been unbelievable. I've got so much positive feedback from people all around the world who are really getting so much out of this. And this is not the end, but it is a pause in what we're doing here. So thank you, and please open up the conversation for Stoic God.
All right. Well, it's been great, Simon and Kai and everybody. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And let me be honest, I've always felt like, because I'm surrounded by people who really understand this stuff, and I can't just get away saying anything. I've been researching my ass off every time I do this, right? So I want to thank you guys for making me do that. Okay.
Yeah, let me just tell everybody, like, after pretty much every session, Kai has come to me, has been like, Leo just sent me like pages of notes this week. He's just, he's just been going absolutely nuts here. And so, yeah, like, Leo, your work has paid off, seriously, because you're really helping a lot of people to get this sort of stuff. So great work, man. You've been
Awesome.
brilliant.
Awesome, man. And it's been helping me too. So I'm very thankful about that. I got to tell you, let me, I'd like to kick off this section just by stating that in some respects, I'm very lucky that as an international relations theorist, I come from a political assumption about the Stoics and their view of God, right? Why am I saying that? Because of especially the strain we see now in contemporary Stoicism, if that's a thing, right? That they, how much do we need the Stoic conception of God, and so on and so on. I find this very interesting, and I'm going to leave it to philosophers like Marcus to decide how much pantheism is like atheism. For me, I struggle with it a lot. I don't think they can be the same. If something is all God and nothing is God, I don't possibly see how these things can be the same thing, right? I don't see how pantheism can be a sexed up atheism. But I'm going to look at it from political assumption of identifying as a thing is not enough to actually be that thing. Right. So, for example, I can't just claim to be a Latino because I watch telenovelas. Right. I mean, I have to, in some respect, be incorporated by the people in that community. That's just a political assumption. We can argue that assumption some other time, but that's the assumption I'm kind of going with the Stoics. Now, the Stoics we love are all dead and gone. What we have left is their writings. So, my question is, to what extent would the ancient Stoics have accepted a Stoic that is an atheist? And through, the more I read about this, like as I was doing research for this, I was wondering, I remember there being some arguments for the existence of God. I'm going to try to find a few of them, just everywhere I went was just argument after argument after argument, or claim after claim after claim, whether or not and many of those arguments are not very good, but still, like the position I'm on is like, the Stoics would not have accepted an atheist Stoic as a Stoic, right? And it's not like they didn't know what atheism was exactly, or who, what the atheist position is. They knew who the atheists were. They were, Zeno's philosophical mom, right? His Crates' wife, right, as he's training under Cynic philosophy, was sexually assaulted by an atheist. Right, in one of the stories. So they knew who the atheists were. I mean, the Epicureans were the closest things that came to atheists, probably into some respect as well, right? And to them, maybe at best, the gods just don't care about humanity, things like this. So the Stoics are pantheists through and through. Now, they're, in a sense, also, like you mentioned, Simon, some of them are pantheists plus, right? So they're pantheists as their prima facie view on God, but also some of them have a very they anthropomorphize God more than others, like Epictetus does, right? He says, "Oh, I have he talks about God all the time as having will and desires, and also he talks about his little temple in his own house, as in the corner of his house, right, where presumably he has the gods of the Greeks and Romans." But even the early Stoics, this isn't a Roman Stoic thing. The early Stoics just wrote book after book after book on gods. And I remember like looking at it, there's this one thing that Chrysippus says, and I thought it was so important that I wrote it down here. Chrysippus says, For one can find no other starting point or origin for justice except the one derived from Zeus, and that derived from the common nature. I mean, to me, that's like case closed, right? I mean, even just to do ethics, you're taking this point of view that, okay, God exists, at least as the logos, as common nature, as natural law. God exists, and then we can do everything after that, right? We can study ethics, we can study physics and logic after this assumption. Now, so what does that mean for someone like me that's been studying this for so long? And for me, Stoicism is like, for me, Stoicism, I got to tell you, I am comfortable not calling myself a Stoic, right? I'm saying, like, the Stoics we all love are dead and gone. So what can we learn from them? Rather than starting from me planting my flag as I'm a Stoic. Now, how can I change Stoicism to fit what I'm talking about, right? To me, this is useless. Okay, this is not what I'm doing here. Maybe someone else can do that. I'm not doing that here. So for me, it's like, okay, well, what are the ancient Stoics trying to tell us without changing them necessarily to fit what I think? And I think that through and through, you get this pantheistic approach to God, and there may be some kind of problem here in the sense, like, for example, I just recently got back from my first time at the Grand Canyon, right? And everything everybody says about that's been there is true. Like, no picture or video you will see will do justice to this, the holiness and sublimity of the Grand Canyon, right? If I try to put it in words, what am I telling you? Yeah, it's a big hole in the ground, right? Which it is, but none of that just does justice to the sublimity of it. So, to some extent, the Stoics are writing book after book after this, and they're seeing this logos that we use as words, and they're seeing this common homologousness or homology, right, between the words that we use and the rationality of the universe and the reasonableness in human beings. And the closest thing I've found that will help me, I'm not saying everybody who's into Stoicism has to view it this way, but for me as an international relations theorist, it's the closest thing I can see to it is like the anarchism of the international world. Okay, like the international world is made up out of from units in the system, and from that, the anarchism of it is just the structure, the structure, the way it's set up, the way these things must relate to each other. It's separable conceptually from the units in the system, but only conceptually. The way the Stoic God is inseparable from the stuff, from the units, if you will, of the cosmos, and it's only separable conceptually from this. It is something immanent through and through, and that's the way I read the Stoics, right?
Yeah, thanks, Kai, and sorry, Leo, and Kai, did you want to jump in there? Actually, can I just first? I'm going to say one thing, because you mentioned that you're kind of diving back in now, and you start seeing all of these arguments for God open up, and I recently realized that there's a real, like, perceptual problem with reading. There's many perceptual problems with reading, right? But one of them seems to be that if you're not looking for something, you may not find it, right? And if you do start to open your mind to looking for something, it'll appear, right? And I noticed this because I went through a large period there where I was very similar to a lot of people, where it's kind of, looking at Stoicism as what can it do for me just as a philosophy, not necessarily as a theology. And so I wasn't interested in what they were saying about God or the divine or providence or anything like that. And I went back and I read this quote that I had highlighted from Epictetus, right? And I'd highlighted this passage. And then I decided to keep on reading the part that I hadn't highlighted. And then he goes on to start talking about providence and God and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I didn't even see this. I wasn't interested in it. And that seems to be like a real problem with reading, right? It's like how do you even get yourself to that stage where you're like, where it's not just about like highlighting the part that particularly pertains to you, right? It's like, what is he trying to say here, right? And I just didn't see it. And I think many people might be like that, especially with something like Stoicism. But Kai, I'll let you jump in as well.
I mean, it was quite funny. Last weekend was StoicCon, and people a friend of mine texted me and said, Steve Careful, he won't mind me saying that, the guy, another podcaster, he was like, Kai, your fingers must be really sore because you're really banging on that keyboard. And I was banging on the keyboard. I think you were asleep at that point, but I was ferociously banging on that keyboard. Precisely because people say, because Massimo Palucci was basically saying we didn't need a Stoic God. And I was thinking, wow. So I had to type, right? I just felt just driven, probably possibly like a maniac, to kind of say, well, it's not like this obscure thing, is it? It's not like tucked away in a particular fragment that no one's ever seen before, or, something, one particular Stoic just mentioned it off the cuff, and maybe we can ignore it. This is actually the core of Stoicism, because I'm like, the whole virtue ethics hangs on that. There's no way I can hang my coat on an atheistic peg. There is just no peg to hang it upon. So I was saying, to people, I'm not saying you should be Stoic, right? That's not my business. And I'm not going to tell you, you shouldn't call yourself a Stoic if you don't believe this. But it seems quite critical to me in the same way that Jesus Christ dying on a cross seems critical to me, to Christianity. So it's like, for me, it really is like saying, well, our virtue ethics doesn't require a innocent lamb to die on the cross and to be the perfect sacrifice, which is why his bones don't break, right? The reason why Pontius Pilate marvels that Jesus is dead is because his legs are not broken and he's died in record time on the cross, which is why they check that he's dead and they separate the blood, that they stab him in the heart and they separate the blood and the water. If you take Jesus Christ away from Christian ethics, you don't have Christian ethics. What you have is some kind of ethics, but they aren't Christian. So I was thinking, when Leonidas said, and it was in his notes, and I thought it was brilliant, even if atheism is true, that doesn't make it Stoic. Like, the question is not, is God true or not? Does Stoicism have any space for it to be atheistic in interpretation? And if you're going to look at if you're going to base your Stoicism on what the ancient Stoics wrote, the answer is absolutely not. There's just no way you can interpret the Stoics as in an atheistic interpretation. In the same way, there's no way you can interpret Christianity without, a Messiah. It's fundamental. When you take away the Messiah, you have something else. So if people were a little bit more, I don't know, it's a new Stoicism, which is why I really liked Lawrence Beckett in the way that he did it. He said, this is not Stoicism, this is a new Stoicism. I can argue about the name, but he didn't claim it to be Stoicism. Because people say, well, is it so fundamentally important? And it's like, well, yes. One aspect, like Leo was saying about being Latino, might be that you watch soap operas or telenovelas. That might be the case. But it's very hard to say to somebody, you are not Latino, because you have a Mexican passport, and you say, well, most Mexicans are considered to be Latino. That does seem to be quite integral to my claim of being Latino. So I also feel like having a God, regardless of whether God exists or not, that's really not relevant to, can Stoicism exist ethically without a God? The answer for me is no. Why? Because Cleanthes, cry him to Zeus. Chrysippus has proofs. Again, not all the proofs are good, and some of the proofs are definitely not good, right? I'm not questioning that. Epictetus, Posidonius, Spherus, like all of them. It's like, hang on a minute, every single Stoic, bar none, said that there was a God and that virtue was an objective thing based on the Logos, which was God. So the only Stoics that I can find that claim otherwise are people like Massimo Pilucci, who has recently come out and said he doesn't really see himself quite as a Stoic anymore. So I was like, and this is what Leonidas has spoken about with me with the Lipsius trap. Like, sometimes we bend something so badly that either we break or it breaks, but we can't continue. So in that case, maybe Massimo's belief system in Stoicism break. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for him, but one has to break. So you break Stoicism into something else. I'm not saying it's not valuable. Again, I'm not questioning whether it's valuable. That's a different question. I'm not questioning whether it's true. I'm in terms of, is God true? But I'm saying, I just can't see. There's no way that I can see, and having spoken to A.A. Long and Chris Gill and other academics, how you can really claim to be living Stoicism and say there's no God. And that was very long-winded, Simon, so I apologize.
No, seriously. I think if I could just maybe push back on one thing. Like, I'm very interested in, what are the actual arguments that the Stoics make for God, and are they reasonable? Do they and not necessarily to say the question of God always needs to exist in that realm of human reason, because there are limits, right? There are limits to how much we can truly discover with this capacity. So, to me, I'm kind of wondering, what did they say about God? What was their argument? And also, I would just push back in one area to say that I'm less interested in, does taking God away kind of ruin ancient Stoicism? To the Stoics, I kind of always would have felt that, Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Masonius, they probably all would have said, hey, listen, if you can show me how I can have ethics without God, then I will gladly come over to your way of thinking, and I will gladly update the philosophy to make it. I think that they would have said that, right? Because truth to them surely stood on a higher realm than, well, a whole bunch of ancient Stoics who I have ascribed to believed in God, and therefore I have to also, they would have said, well, let's update the philosophy. And if we're just kind of, in mythological terms, if we're just kind of feeding off the dead corpse of our ancestors in this philosophy, and just trying to reach back and grab onto that, we've got to allow the living waters to flow into the philosophy. But one of the ways we do that is by actually respecting our ancestors enough to say, well, maybe they were onto something here. What were they onto? And where were they just psychopaths, right? And we've got to balance that, right? We've got to balance those two worlds and bring them together so that we actually rejuvenate the culture. And so I think, if I could throw it over to you guys, maybe just give me, a few of these arguments that you saw for the existence of God. And if I could also just add on to that, I'm very interested in this idea of the logos. Obviously, the Stoics had a high importance on the logos as this it's kind of like the central animating spirit. It's right. It's like, especially of Western culture, it's this spark within that connects you to the divinity of the whole, allows you to turn things to order by the way that we name things. And I just want to say this as well. In my study of Seneca, you take a look at how the early church fathers of Christianity actually believed that Seneca was kind of like a proto-Christian, right? Like, he was around that time, like he was born at around the same time as Christ. He's kind of in that world when Christianity is kind of just floating around, starting to bubble up, right? And a lot of the way that he talks about God and his ethics, it's like you can put that next to the sayings of Christ, and it's like there's so much similarity in the things that they say there. But it's just interesting that there's that kind of mixing of the worlds. You can almost see Christianity as taking a lot of these Stoic principles and incorporating it into this Judeo or Jewish tradition as well. But anyway, nonetheless, I want to throw it over to you. What are some of these main arguments that the Stoics are making for God, and how do they see God?
Okay, Leo, can I just jump in
Sure.
just for one sentence? I think if you could prove to them there was no God, they'd have no alternative, personally, I think, but to leave Stoicism, because it hinges so much. In the same way, if I could prove to somebody that Jesus Christ didn't die on the cross and was risen again, I don't think there's any Christianity to rescue. But I'll now throw it over to Leonidas to tell you why they'd have to abandon it because of the way their arguments perform. So, Leo, if I throw that now to you.
Yeah. So, of the stuff that survives, right? You get the impression that most of the time they didn't feel like they needed to argue for the existence of God. Like, it was a claim, right? So when they did argue for God, right? So so when they felt like they had to, you get the impression, all right, and this is a little speculation, but it's not far from the mainstream here, that so many of these arguments are kind of to remind themselves or to have themselves like go to like dicta in order to be able to respond to something, or to kind of base the rest of their thought on this. But you so some of these arguments are specious, but there's a few major streams here. So one of them is like the cosmological argument, right? Basically, when you look at the world, you understand that it wasn't made for anything else but human beings. Therefore, someone had to take with human beings in mind. Kind of the same way if you see a mansion, you understand that it wasn't made for the rats. It was made for the human beings in it, right? So things like that. Or for Chrysippus, for example, he has like 3 arguments that come down to us. And one is the appeal to prophecy, right? Like I said, not all these arguments are good. But if we can have knowledge of the future or knowledge of the divine, then if someone can prophesize, then that prophecy must come from somewhere. So it has to come from the divine. All right. So an appeal to prophecy. I think on its best day, we could, if we're being super charitable to this argument, to me, it seems something like meteorology. If I can have knowledge of the future, if I know whether or not I have to carry an umbrella this weekend, right, or 3 days from now, then I have to understand that there's some rational order to the cosmos, and that rational order is God. That's the most charitable way I can put this argument, right? But for Cleanthes, for example, there was also an appeal to fear, like during astronomical events, particularly when, if you ever see like a kind of a close-up shooting star, sometimes it can be quite scary. And the ancients, imagine the ancients not having the scientific knowledge that we did, like they would, they would see these astronomical events, and then that up for Cleanthes, that appeal to fear, like the first thing you think about was God, and to him that was God saying, "You see, I did that," right? Another one was an appeal, like a part of the cosmological argument was this appeal to orderly beauty. So it was like an aesthetic judgment in the world of how beautiful it is. That beauty must have been done by God. And the different Stoics, when they do argue for God, they kind of argue that whether they have differences, whether or not it's the fixed stars are the substance of God, or whether God is the air, or whether God is a fire, right? So they all kind of put their spin on it, but none of them are doubting God's existence, and none of them are doubting the importance of God in Stoic philosophy. Now, there's someone, the closest I've seen about someone doubting it is one line from Panaetius and one line from Marcus, and both of these aren't very doubtful of God, right? So Panaetius, at one point, he doubts the conflagration and he doubts prophecy. Right. So he says prophecy, maybe it's all BS, right? Something like this. And that's the closest he'll ever get. Not doubting God, just doubting that prophecy, can exist. And the ekperosis, the conflagration at the end, kind of like their equivalent of a big crunch, right? As what happens to the universe at the end of it. Like the Stoics thought that it would all turn into fire at the end. It would all just turn into fire. Like he kind of doubted that was true. But none of that suggests that he doubted God is true. Now, Marcus, at one point, the famous line in contemporary circles is like, atoms are providence. But through and through, Marcus rejects the merely atoms part to say that, well, there's providence and there's whatever you want to take providence to be in Stoicism. That is basically the Stoic view of it. So to me, to take that away is kind of, well, let me be honest with you, and I'll just to put a point on it. For me, calling oneself a Stoic in the ancient sense is like calling oneself a Roman legionary, right? Like, yes, you can be very tough. You can admire the Roman legionaries, but in what sense are you a legionary outside of your own mind? Even if you're wearing the lorica segmentata and you're waving around your gladius, right? There's a reason we don't fight in maniples anymore, right? You don't have to be a Roman legionary to be super tough. Just like you don't have to be a Stoic to be, resilient and kind, compassionate, tough, right? So what do you get out of it by calling yourself a Stoic and not accepting like the claim after claim after claim, not even saying that you have to accept every argument for God, but just a claim after claim that the Stoics are saying about God, all right?
Yeah, and I'm certainly going to have a conversation with you about prophecy at some point, because that's been my whole topic of with my assignment recently, and my whole class, my first class in theology was studying prophecy, and very interesting things to say about that. But nonetheless, yeah, Kai, did you want to jump in with anything there?
I think it's also like, when we think about it, the reason why we have so little Stoicism is because so many people rejected it. Like, we are now rejecting the very little that remains. The majority of Stoicism is gone. It's destroyed. And thank you, church. Like, thank you so much for doing that. You did the contemporary Stoics job for them. If the very little that remains, you're going to now burn. Like, this is the challenge I have. Like, we have so little that remains. And yet, the little that remains talks about God all the time, or draws upon the logos. And now in contemporary circles, we're like, no, that's not what we want in life. And it's like, well, that's probably why we don't have the Republic, because the rich people who didn't want to, the people to rise and didn't think homosexuality was an indifferent, we're like, no, we don't want those values coming into our society and dirtying it. So it's like, why are we doing that? Like, again, I have no issue that someone says to me, I really like aspects of Stoicism. I really enjoy this part. I do believe for some reason that I can't prove that virtue is the only good, because that was the argument that I was banging on with a keypad. But like I was saying to everybody who was going, yeah, there's no such thing as God. God is not rational. Can you rationally prove to me that virtue is the only good? And no one could. Although Greg Lopez said to me, yes, within Stoicism, I can do that. I said, but that's assuming that Stoicism is correct, Greg. All you're doing is moving that turtle down one, going, yes, if I assume that Stoicism is correct, I can therefore show that virtue is the only good. By the way, I need God to do it. But let's ignore that fact for a second. But that's assuming that Stoicism is correct. So you still have to go, I'm assuming without any evidence whatsoever that the Stoic framing of this argument is the correct one. And if it is the correct one, then this follows, right? But you still have to have a faith-based claim. So you remove the God-based claim and you say it's just virtue just because I want it to be, basically, because it's my preferences and my values. It's a Becker argument that the reason we know how to be virtuous is because of our values and our preferences. I'm like, you're obviously not in my field. I actually said this to you once. So you're not in the environmental field. We don't see it that way because our preferences and values have destroyed the world. We have a climate breakdown issue because, international relations must be exactly the same thing. The reason why we're at war is precisely because of our preferences and values. They don't necessarily take us down a virtuous route. They might do, but that's not necessarily the case. So I remind the atheistic interpreters, like, you're just moving the faith-based claim to something else, whatever makes you happy, but you're not removing yourself from the empirical proof that you want. They'll say, prove to me, you can't prove there's a God. Well, you can't prove there isn't. Like, that's why I'm like, it doesn't matter, because I've said to people before as well, it doesn't necessarily matter what's true. What matters actually is what you believe to be true. And that's the case for everybody. Like, a lot of people do things, crazy things or good things because they believe it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether it actually is or it isn't. Like, for example, I spoke to Sarah about something very, cancel culture. I believed it was the right thing to do. Now, whether that was the right thing to do is debatable, it's questionable, and judging by the hate that ensued, I certainly think it was the right thing to do. But other people would take that as a consequence and go, that was a terrible thing to do, all that hate. Like, no, this is precisely. But that's a value judgment, right? I'm not basing that on some objective, necessarily objective value of God. So I just try to remind agnostic interpreters or atheistic ones, they're just moving the faith-based claim elsewhere. They can't get out of that problem. And with David Hume, they can't get out of the fact-based fact and value distinction. I know there's like Philippa Foot has argued against David Hume. Yes, there are philosophers who've said David Hume's claim is not a correct one. But that's debatable. That's why we're still in debate. The reason why it's debatable is because we're still talking about it. So I just feel like they can't escape that issue. And I don't have an issue if they say, I don't have a problem with people saying, well, I don't really want to lean on God. So I'm going to do exactly what you said you did, Simon, of I'm going to be blinkered. And every time I read about God, I'm just going to ignore the fact. I'm just going to wipe it from my memory, Matrix style, just not going to see it. I don't have the issue with that. The issue that I have is that people go around and tell others that if they believe in God, they're not being, quote unquote, modern, which is why I think I've said before that originally the contemporary Stoic main website was called Stoicism Today. And the modern part came in when people said we should kind of try to update the ethics by removing God. And I'm like, I'm not really sure that was reasonable, acceptable, or necessary. And I would much rather people just said this is Stoic influenced rather than Stoicism, because at which point does Stoicism no longer have a Stoic flavor? And I would argue strongly when you remove the logos, there's no Stoicism left. I don't know, Leonidas, if you want to.
Can we talk to this logos for a moment? And also, Kai, you mentioned virtue. Something Seneca says here. He says that special virtue which we seek is magnificent, not because to be free of evil is in itself so marvelous, but because it unchains the mind, prepares it for a realization of heavenly things, and makes it worthy to enter into an association with God. So what's Seneca getting at here with this idea of virtue being the thing that gets us into an association with God?
Right. So this is off the cuff, right? I would like to have seen that whole section in context. But one of Seneca's points is that God is a kind of thing that is perfect by nature, right? Human beings are perfect when they're perfect at all is by effort. So by perfecting ourselves, that is when we're just in the right shape or in the right tension with the universe, with the rest of God, right? So that's Seneca's view kind of through and through, right? Just kind of like God cannot face the evils that we face. We can overcome the evils, right? God can't do that, right? So in that sense, Seneca says we're actually only in that sense are we superior than God. God cannot face the evils that we face. We are the ones that have to face them and overcome them. But that being said, Seneca is also like notoriously cynical about religion, right? And St. Augustine kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, he nails him to the cross on this one. He's Seneca, you're worse than the actors. At least the actors aren't trying to persuade you that they are who, they are the role they're playing. You are, right? You're standing there next to Nero, like nodding your head or whatever it is supposed to do as the whole procession comes through, pretending you believe in these things and you don't. And Seneca understood this. And even the early Stoics, you go back to the early Stoics, they'll say the sage will lie if he is a statesman, right? So the sage will put on this face like religion is true, right? Religion is the way we should live. But understand that this is just things people say. I mean, Cornutus, the Stoic, wrote through and through. He wrote taking these ancient myths as a way to explain the world around him. Chrysippus scandalously kind of gave a theory for the beginning of the world, beginning of the cosmos, as a story about sex between Zeus and Hera, right? And this was outrageous. But he's using this as a story about how the world was made. So they had no problem using these stories. And they were almost like, and I forget the name of the secret society because it's kind of off the cuff, but there was a secret society that thought that human beings should be given should be given their religion, but the elite will know that there's only this pantheistic God, right? So I read the Stoics something like that. And like Zeno says, nothing by human beings is worth very much. And temples are made by human beings. So temples are not worth very much. So even though he's willing to say the God of a city should be Eros and this should be worship because it provides concord, still nothing we say about God could possibly do, or nothing we do about God, even building temples, is worth very much because it's built by human hands. Kind of like the way me trying to explain the Grand Canyon to you. You just kind of have to see it for yourself, right? And I think the Stoics look, that's the logos. Unfortunately, words can only take us so far. And I think the Stoics were very, very optimistic about how much words can accomplish. I tend to be less optimistic. For us, knowing what we know, words aren't invented to explain things. Words are invented okay, when there's no rain here, there is you can find water on the other side of the ridge, or there's food in this hole. That's why we apes developed words, right? Now we're trying to explain God with it. The Stoics were a little more optimistic than we were about how we can use words for this. But even they understood that no matter what we say about God, at the end of the day, none of this is worth very much. You just kind of have to accept this pantheistic view and then make some arguments later about appeal to fear, appeal to the beauty of the universe, this kind of thing, right?
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm going to have one more question here, and then I'm going to bring everybody in because I know that we've been taking up a lot of time here, which is great. But I want to throw you guys to the lions, as it were. Okay, so I want to talk to that idea of words as these things that allow us to kind of break down the world into its parts, because it seems to me like part of the logos, and this does relate to prophecy as well, what I'm about to say, but I'll leave that to aside for now. The logos to me seems to be this principle that, okay, the world is perceivable through pattern and symbol. It's perceivable through that. There's a hierarchical nature to the cosmos, and you could even say that, okay, well, to be atheists is to perhaps believe that human beings and our reason, to place too heavy a bound on reason is to say that this is the highest thing in the cosmos at the moment. We can perceive things because we have this thing called reason, but nonetheless, there's this hierarchical nature, and you might want to think from time to time, well, what is above me in the hierarchy of the cosmos, right? Like, am I it? Is this the ceiling? And so if you could, either of you perhaps talk to this hierarchical nature that, Marcus Aurelius certainly talks about, or just the patterned way that we can view the cosmos. And it seems to me, by the way, just quickly, if you see the kind of hierarchical nature, you see the pattern, I'm doing that because it seems to me like it's something that can help you to see that over time, history has a cyclical nature. And in a way, isn't that what some of these prophets were doing? They were seeing the cyclical nature of history. They were seeing the patterned nature of time and the cosmos, and seeing that we're on the cusp of a breakdown that I've seen before, and that's what we're all trying to do here. But anyway, so yeah, can you talk to the pattern, the hierarchy nature, that sort of thing? Oh, we can't hear you.
You're on mute.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think you bring up a really good point. And I got to tell you, this is a part of the Stoics that I kind of find very interesting, is their view of this conflagration, this eternal return, right? For example, we're living in a world now where it's quite similar in many ways to the Bronze Age collapse, right? And there's a book written about this, and I can find that for you later.
Leo's about to prophesy, by the way.
Yeah, right. But what is interesting to me is, like, since at least Kant, and Marcus could probably tell you more this than I can, but at least since Kant, we've have a progressive view of history, right? That for Kant, at least in his political works, he's saying human beings can improve, and nature itself will help us improve. Because we cannot perfect ourselves individually, nature will help will help human beings improve till we eventually perfect ourselves. We'll have a world without war. We'll have a world of perpetual peace. We can have perpetual peace of all of us killing each other, and the perpetual peace of the graveyard, or the perpetual peace of a federation of republics where it'll be it'll be big cosmopolis, right? Now, since Kant, you have Hegel and Marx, and we have kind of this progressive view of history. The Stoics didn't think like this. The Stoics had more of a political realist view, what we might call now, or like Thucydides' view of this kind of that this will always happen. In the political world, human beings, scumbags that they are, will constantly have war happening, right? And just in the physical view of Heraclitus and the Stoics, of this eternal return. So I like this very much. I think that this is very like the world that we're in, is very like the Bronze Age collapse, in the sense that it wasn't just one civilization collapsing. It was several, because of their interconnectedness. And the ones that managed to scrape by, like Egypt, were just barely managing to scrape by. And the ones that didn't were just saw climate change, refugees, right? The sea peoples that came out of everywhere, taking over and being blamed for much of the destruction that probably wasn't their fault anyways. So you have this through and through, and I see something like that again. To the Stoics, it would have been they would have accepted this kind of eternal return. I think that is the part of God for the Stoics that is most relevant to us, not this Kantian or Hegelian view of progression of history. That is not my understanding of international politics, right? My understanding is this return of more of the same. And I think there's at least an analogy, if not homology, between the political realm and the physical realm of this eternal return with what's happening with climate and the earth and civilization. And I like the Stoic view of God, not so much like what you were saying, and you were certainly right about this hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of the cosmos. Where is it? There's got to be one, right? Because we have a ruling faculty like that. The cosmos must have a ruling faculty. So they certainly did think that. But they also, on the flip side of that coin, they also saw this interconnection, this web of connection between everything, the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, and everything else, and this web of connection of everything in the cosmos, which is why prophecy worked, right? In the way we might say, the way why we can make theories and predictions about the future in the, at least meteorology, but I would say even to some extent in the political world, right? We can make these prophecies, if you will. I'm doing air quotes here, these prophecies, if you will, because there's a pattern to this. And the point is to understand the pattern. When you understand that pattern, you've understood the Stoic God.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to thewalledgarden.com. See you there.